Thank you, Annette. The laptop has been moving around, so I haven't had the opportunity to actually remind myself what I'm going to say. So it's going to be a bit of a voyage of discovery for all of us. I'd like to first acknowledge Annette and say thank you for organising this and also extending the invitation to me to talk. I'd also like to say that I feel a bit of an imposter in front of this audience. Suicidal behaviour is not actually a specialty of mine, it's something that I've kind of fallen into. And I've got a sense from chatting to some of you already that this is something you spent a lot longer thinking about than I have. I'd also like to just acknowledge Lynn, who actually you'll recognise from this picture, because actually she's been involved in some of the work that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I should warn you in advance, this is my apology, I went straight to Victoria University after leaving school. I am fully institutionalised. If the university was to close down, I would be incapable of getting a proper job. I am thoroughly inculcated in the ways of academia, and I'm going to constantly be reminding myself to try not to focus on the statistics. So feel free to gesticulate if I'm overcomplicating things. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is actually the product of an awful lot of effort by an awful lot of people. This photograph doesn't show all of the people involved. I'll tell you a little bit about the history. I think something like 2005, 2006, the red-headed woman there to the left, to your left, is my wife, she was working in a youth specialty service in Wellington. And she came home one day and she said, you know what, just about everybody I see has been hurting themselves. And this was interesting to me because I don't understand that personally. I remember back at school, you know, Eddie, he'd sit at the back of the class and stick drawing pins in his arm, but well, that wasn't self-injury, was it? That was just him being hard. And I think this reflects a couple of things, and I'll allude to these in the course of today, that the way that we think about things changes over time, and in fact, as we think about them more, we find them more obviously in our everyday lives. So where am I going to go with this? This is the team of people who I currently have the pleasure of working with. I won't go to the trouble of naming them all. Now, I'm particularly interested in non-suicidal self-injury, and there are a variety of reasons for this. And as it says up there, this is a definition that comes from the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. It is the deliberate self-inflicted destruction of body tissue without suicidal intent and for purposes non-socially sanctioned. It is also sometimes referred to as self-injurious behaviour, non-suicidal, self-directed violence, self-harm, or deliberate self-harm, although some of these terms, such as self-harm, do not differentiate non-suicidal from suicidal intent. This is kind of important, because as has already been pointed out by several of the previous speakers today, engaging in self-injurious behaviour that doesn't lead to suicide is a really good predictor, a really good risk factor for subsequently attempting and succeeding in completing suicide. As such, NSSI is distinguished from suicidal behaviours involving an intent to die, drug overdoses and socially sanctioned behaviours performed for display or aesthetic purposes. Sorry, if you're multiply pierced, like my first-year psychology students, that doesn't count. We've reached a point in history where I feel seriously under-tattooed and under-pierced compared to my students. Although cutting is one of the most well-known NSSI behaviours, it can take many forms, including but not limited to burning, scratching, self-bruising or breaking bones, etc., etc. And just to kind of sum up the state of the research in this area, I'm just going to quote directly from an important 2010 review by Matthew Nock, who's a Harvard-based researcher, probably one of the two most influential people in this area, I think. And he says, non-suicidal self-injury most often involves cutting oneself with a knife or razor, typically begins in early adolescence, occurs among people with a wide range of psychiatric disorders, and in some cases in those with no disorder, is associated with an increased risk of suicide attempt and does not appear to differ as a function of sex, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. That's kind of interesting because I'm not entirely sure that that's consistent with what we know about suicide, for example. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you for a little tour through some of the research that I've done on this topic, and I'm going to finish by talking about the research that I'm currently engaged in, which does involve, is increasingly involving a much greater focus on suicidal as well as non-suicidal behaviour. Now why do people do it? Why do young people in particular hurt themselves? This is the interactive part of the session. I know that there are people among you who work to support young people, so what do you think? Yes?
Stop the pain or feel pain in a different area outside of the inside.
So to stop the pain or to feel pain in a different modality outside rather than inside. Okay, I like that. Anything else? They don't know how to express themselves any other way. Someone had a hand up the back? Because if I don't do it, I'm not part of the group. We've already had a discussion around clusters and contagion.
Yeah, too much emotion inside, it's a way of letting it out.
Too much emotion inside, it's a way of letting it out. Now those are examples. We could actually spend quite a bit of time. I'm pretty sure that if we wanted to, we could spend more time thinking of a greater diversity of reasons. And the thing is that they're all going to be right for at least someone some of the time. And I think this is one of the things that makes it such a difficult behaviour to work with, because it is multi-determined. Basically, it means that there is no one-size-fits-all. Two people can engage in the same form of self-injurious behaviour for very different reasons. Two people can do two very different things, but for the same reason. Now, this is one of the dominant models. You don't need to actually pay attention to this. Essentially, what it is it's called the experiential avoidance model. And basically, coming back to some of the reasons why some of you just identified why young people in particular might engage in self-injury, it says stuff goes on in our worlds, okay, and it causes us to have very, very strong emotional experiences. And for a variety of reasons, some of us are less capable or less well equipped to deal with it. Or the tools that we've been given by the people we have watched as our role models may not be the best ones to use. So, for those people who engage in self-injury, what this model says is that people self-injure to avoid those emotional experiences which are almost exclusively caused by these really, really negative life experiences going on. We've seen some of those already on the slides today. If you have a parent who experiences significant mental health problems, for example, there's been allusion to relationship style problems as well. These are things that, particularly for young people, they may not be well equipped to actually deal with. So this is typically the model that I use when I'm thinking about self-injurious behaviour. Young people do it to avoid the emotional experiences that come along with bad stuff happening to them in their everyday lives. So how prevalent is it? I can actually update this a little bit. These are statistics these date probably back to sort of late 2011, early 2012. A range of different studies. For example, analysis of ED presentations across 4 different regions over 12 months indicated 2,000 presentations to emergency departments for self-injurious behaviour. And 20% of those were from people who had actually engaged with services more than once. A second study showed that lifetime prevalence amongst community-based New Zealand adults sits somewhere around about 24%. So this is Sharmila Nataraja's work out of the Dunedin multidisciplinary study. 48% of adolescents presenting to CAMS reported self-harm at initial assessment. This is a study authored by Fortune and colleagues in Auckland. It's based on an analysis of case reports of adolescents presenting to CAMS services in Auckland. I think what they did was to identify, they took a random sample of 100 cases, and almost exactly 50% of those young people had engaged in self-injury and reported that at the time of the initial assessment. Now, this seems to be pretty high because, in fact, Matthew Knock, in that review paper that I quoted from, would typically say, in terms of prevalence, the international research suggests that something like between 1% and 4% of adults have engaged in self-injury at some point in their lives, whereas between about 13% and 24% of young people would do so. At the same time, what he would acknowledge is that we know that people who have experience of mental health difficulties are disproportionately likely to engage in self-injury. 20% of 9,000 secondary students reported self-harm in the previous year. That comes from the Youth 2000 study. I've messed up the reference there, I need to change that. And in a study that used exactly the same question as used in the Youth 2000 studies conducted by Pryor and Jose at Victoria University, about 31% of 1,700 secondary students thought of self-harm in the previous month, and 20% acted on it at some point over the 5 years of their study. Now, one of the things that you can't tell from looking at this is the intent behind the self-injury. And this is a major problem for researchers in this area. It's very difficult to establish intent. We know that self-report is biased. We know that ambivalence towards death can influence what people say when they're subsequently talking about self-injury. We know that there's research that suggests that something, maybe as much as 30% of people who engage in self-injurious behaviour and said immediately afterward they did so because they wanted to die, say retrospectively actually that's not the case, but it made the most sense for me to say it at the time. And there is a big turf war going on between primarily European-based and North American-based researchers as to how we conceptualise self-injury and as a result measure it, because the sorts of things that the way we assess it might have implications for issues around intent, and I'll illustrate that in a second. I think in 2010-2011 the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health estimated that something like $2 billion a year is lost in association with self-injurious behaviour, again conflating suicidal with non-suicidal self-injury. I think that 30 million is a wonderful amount of money to put towards this, but it pales in comparison to the costs that are associated with people engaging in these behaviours. So here's my very first study. There might even be people in the audience who participated in this, I don't know. I surveyed my first year psychology students, intellectual cream of our youth. They've had to compete to get to university. They must be particularly well adjusted. Imagine my surprise. 78%, almost 79% of them said that they'd engaged in at least one form of self-injurious behaviour, at least according to Sansone et al.'s self-harm inventory. I'll come back to this in a second. These are the questions that inventory asks. Have you ever overdosed, cut yourself, burned yourself, hit yourself, banged yourself, abused alcohol, driven recklessly on purpose, engaged in emotionally or sexually abusive relationships, distanced yourself from God? It's a very interesting question. You can tell this is a North American inventory. The only people in my sample who answered yes to that were actually of Pacifica origin. And if we get the chance, I'll talk a little bit more about that. You can see it's very, very broad. And it's also probably not consistent with that definition of non-suicidal self-injury. It includes things that make it very difficult to ascertain the intent. Overdosing, for example, is particularly tricky. Overdosing is tricky because some people might engage in overdosing without realising the potential lethality of what they're doing. Other people may know exactly what they're doing. Whereas, for example, burning yourself with cigarettes is extraordinarily unlikely to lead to loss of life. So what a lot of people now do when they're assessing non-suicidal self-injury is they limit the types of behaviours that they ask about to things which would be highly unlikely to lead to loss of life. Now, if we go back to that statistic, even when I take out the things which are indirect, so I take out the emotionally abusive relationships, driving recklessly or drinking to excess, the lifetime history of tissue damage related self-injury drops to a mere 55%. Now that's not that different from the statistics reported by Fortune and colleagues in their study of CAMS patients. Okay. This led me to suspect that perhaps this is a bit more common than I might have thought. So I went on to look at it in a bit more detail. In our second study, this is the work of Jessica Garish. She did this for her honours project. We went into a local area secondary school. We were lucky enough to get permission to survey all of their students aged 16 and above, and we used a single item to assess self-injurious behaviour. In this study we found 15%. It's a big difference between these two. Here's the question that we asked. Have you ever deliberately taken an overdose, e.g. of pills, medication, other toxic substances, or tried to harm yourself in some other way, such as cut yourself? This is a very different type of question. And it's led, this is a classic example of literature. People have suggested that the answer to the question, how many people do this, is actually not a percentage, but how do you ask the question? Because you get a much bigger percentage the more exemplars that we use. If we ask a single question, then this question has been criticised as being vulnerable to leading participants. It suggests a range of things, but might lead people to think, oh, well, I burned myself, that might not count. So maybe there are some problems there. So in our third and fourth studies on this, these are part of Jessica's PhD study, we use Lund et al.'s deliberate self-harm inventory, a modification of an inventory that was developed by Kim Gratz in North America, which has been validated with adolescents. And it asks people to indicate which of 14 fairly prototypical forms of self-injury they've engaged in. And as you can see, when we do that, we get something like 40 to 50% of young people. These are, that third sample there is across a wide sample of secondary school students in the broader Wellington region. But even when we do it with first year psychology students, we find something relatively similar. And these are the questions that we ask. It's a kind of halfway house between those two questions. We give people specific examples so that we don't run the risk of missing out on people who might do fairly idiosyncratic things which they wouldn't think of if we just say, have you ever hurt yourself deliberately, for example. So by focusing on the behaviour, I think we get a better indication of what's going on. And in a final study I'll talk about now, we did the same thing again with first year psychology students, well-adapted bunch that they are. We used only the 7 most commonly identified forms of self-injury, and we find about 40% there. Now, I've got a little footnote down here that indicates that for this study here, the correlation between reporting a suicide attempt and engagement in self-injurious behaviour, not for suicidal reasons, was about 0.4. This is fairly significant. And I think that this is probably where my research might go in the future. You notice I've been very careful to say non-suicidal self-injury. But how come, if that's the case, people are so much more likely to go on to attempt suicide? What is the link there? What is the mechanism by which one thing leads to another? And there are a number of hypotheses that have been presented. I've tried to simplify some of the usual suspects, the relationships between those things and engagement in non-suicidal self-injury. So these lines represent, the red line represents the largest correlation, so association with, and the blue line represents the smallest association we found between the usual suspects when we're looking at mental health related behaviours and self-injury. So remember, this is a correlation. It's a measure of association. The bigger it is, the stronger the association. If it's above this line, then it means that as one thing goes up, so does the thing we're interested in. If it's below the line, then it says as something goes up, something else goes down. But I'll illustrate that in a second. Now, probably the things to really note to start off with are that consistently having friends who self-injure is a major predictor of your own self-injury. And I think that this is one of the reasons why when we approach schools to talk about the possibility of collaborating with them to do research, they are justifiably wary. If we ask people about this, maybe we're going to cause it to happen. The research now seems to suggest that actually the possibility of iatrogenic effects of self-injury are incredibly small. This gives us reason to be confident that by asking young people about self-injury, we're probably not causing it. Unsurprisingly, depression and anxiety are pretty consistent predictors. In the most recent studies we've done, we've been using the DAS to assess depression and anxiety in our younger samples. Thought suppression, so whether or not young people are very good at putting things out of their minds. There's some interesting research, this is the white bear style research, that shows that when we try to suppress things, we sometimes create what are called ironic effects. So if I say to you now, don't think about a white bear, some of you will be better at it than others, but those of you who are particularly good at it, in the days to come will think of the white bear more than the people who are bad at it. So if I try not to think about something, if I'm successful, I run the risk of actually getting a rebound effect after that, where the thing that I've been trying not to think about is even more present for me. We found associations with eating disordered behaviour. Alexithymia is particularly important for me, and I'll come back to this in a second. Alexithymia is an atrociously technical term for deficits around identifying and understanding and dealing with your emotional experience. And to some extent, that is one of the tasks of adolescence. Your job as an adolescent, at least in part, is to work out how to deal with the emotions that you experience. We have some other things: bullying, attachment to peers and parents, disordered eating, impulsivity, particularly in young men. That part of the brain that would normally go, that's a stupid idea, is underdeveloped. If you're going through an overwhelming experience which is making you feel really bad, some people, if they're particularly impulsive, are more likely to try and deal with it right on the spot and potentially in a maladaptive manner. Substance abuse, unsurprisingly. Sexuality concerns. Note, this isn't sexuality, but whether or not you have been worried about your sexuality. The reason why we ask that question is that sometimes we find ethical problems associated with asking, particularly secondary school students, to talk about their sexuality in terms of bisexual, gay, whatever. So instead, we get around that in part by saying, have you ever, or to what extent do you worry about your sexuality? And we find very similar types of relationships there. It's not so much the sexuality necessarily as the extent to which that might be a problem for you. Perfectionism, ooh, evil perfectionism. I'll show you something about that in a second. A history of abuse. If you've been physically, emotionally, or sexually abused, then you are more likely to report self-injury. There's a very influential review by David Klonsky out of the University of British Columbia, where he did a meta-analysis of studies which have used this, and actually what he concludes is that while it seems to be something that travels alongside self-injury, it's not a major predictor or cause, which I think is useful in some ways. But these are all the things that are risk factors. What about protective factors? Well, self-esteem is the major buffer against self-injury. It's the most consistent, positive buffer that we find in our research. If you feel good about yourself, you're much less likely to report self-injury. Wow, we've solved the problem. Resilience appears to be important. Mindfulness, being able to live in the moment. And we've also tried a variety of ways to assess what some people call emotional intelligence. There is, I think, a real difficulty in this area around how you actually define and measure emotional intelligence. The measures we've used, this is just one of them, typically haven't worked particularly well, and they show minimal types of buffering effects against self-injury. In fact, I think there might even be a reason to think that if you are I can think of a particular type of young person who is very in touch with what they're feeling, for whom that might even be a problem. You spend a lot of time thinking about your emotions, you probably overanalyze things, you might read into situations you find yourself in. Let's return to that alexithymia thing. This is basically emotion regulation, the extent to which you can modify, understand, identify and deal with your emotions. What I have here is this is from Jess's honours thesis. We published this in the British Journal of Psychology, Clinical Psychology. Essentially what it shows is an interaction, and this is one of the really important messages that I'd like to get across today. An interaction is when it's not one thing or another, it's the particular combination of the two. And what this basically says is that the more bullying you experience, the more self-injury you tend to experience, but it's particularly the case for people who have difficulty dealing with their emotions. I don't think this is rocket science. I'm being bullied, I feel really, really crappy about it, I don't know how to deal with it. Well, what am I going to do? Engage in a maladaptive coping strategy like self-injury. The interesting thing here is that actually if you have good emotion regulation skills, it doesn't matter how much you're bullied. It doesn't seem to be particularly more likely that being seriously bullied is going to translate into self-injurious behaviour. I mentioned perfectionism. Perfectionism interacts with alexithymia as well. Now this is negative perfectionism. Does anyone have any idea what negative perfectionism might be? I'll give you a clue. There's also a positive perfectionism, but this isn't it. Does anyone want to have a go at what negative perfectionism might be? Yes?
Is that when your whole well-being and yourself is hinged upon how you perform at academic levels and you're not capable of performing at that high level, that maybe your parents have introduced them, then you feel that maybe you will those down?
The suggestion made is that I'm going to focus on the really important thing you said there, which is about living up to the expectations of others. There's research that shows that having high standards of yourself isn't necessarily automatically a problem unless the reason why you have those unreasonably high expectations of yourself in some cases is being externally imposed. You're trying to be the person that other people want you to be. And again, the same thing happens here. If you are highly perfectionistic and you have trouble dealing or understanding or interpreting your emotions, then you're much more likely to self-injure. One researcher in particular, Jennifer Muhlenkamp, has focused a lot of her research on the role of perfectionism in self-injury and also eating disorders. If there is a common link between those two maladaptive behaviours, then in fact perfectionism might be one of those really important things. Now these are all psychological, contextual, interpersonal predictors, but why do people who self-injure do so? We've already got some possibilities, and I've told you broadly it's to manage your emotional experience. Well, before I do that, this is actually going to be relevant, I think, for Dr. John Crawshaw talking about rolling things out into the community and also to people who are likely to be the ones who people present to experiencing suicidal, in this case non-suicidal ideation. While we were waiting for ethics approval for one of our other survey studies, Robin Langlands, who's also depicted in that picture at the beginning, conducted a survey of people who work with people who self-injure. So we worked with a number of organisations to identify members who fell into that category, and we invited them to participate in a survey, and a surprising number of them did, except for psychiatrists. Interestingly enough, I think this person actually fell into the sample accidentally. I think they were working for a CAM service, because I'm pretty sure that when we paid the psychiatrists organisation to advertise the study, they never did. It's very naughty of them. So we'll ignore the psychiatrists at the moment, but there are two things I want to point out here. In terms of indicating whether or not they'd had any specific professional development for working with people who self-injure, there's variation, but the most striking thing here is the GPs. It's a small group, but not a single one of these people who said that they had had clients who self-injured said they'd ever had professional development specifically around how to work with them. Another issue is that we asked people, have you ever had a client who engaged in self-injury who subsequently suicided, and did you ever have a client who didn't engage in self-injury who suicided? And there are statistically significant differences here in the general direction that these clinicians tended to say, sure, I've had people who self-injured who suicided, but actually I probably had more who never did. And that's really important for us, I think, because sometimes one of the reasons why professionals are concerned about gatekeeping their clients from participating in research is around some of these sorts of issues. They also indicated, here's just an indication of what percentage of people who self-injure do so for a variety of reasons. The most common one was managing intense emotions. The least common was to alleviate boredom, manipulate others, to avoid suicidal thoughts and plans. We've got things here which are very similar to the answers that you gave when I asked you why do people do it. They're about dealing with emotions. Again, from Robin's thesis, we use a measure of functions of self-injury called the Inventory of Statements about Self-Injury, which I much prefer to the alternative measure, which is the Functional Assessment of Self-Mutilation. It's a very evocative term, that. But essentially what it asks people to do is to say, okay, when you self-injure, which of the following things are the reasons for your self-injury? And there are a variety of sets of questions which we boil down to these. But when you statistically analyse them, you end up with two clusters of functions. One is an interpersonal function, where you're doing it to communicate with others. You're doing it to bond with others, potentially. You're doing it to mark how upset you actually are. But there's a really important one here, which is the intrapersonal things. These are the things that people don't see when they look at you. These are the things that are going on in your own head and your own experience, which you're trying to deal with. And one of the things that's really important here is anti-suicide. This is a set of questions which ask about things like, well, I do it because actually I was really worried that if I didn't do something, I was going to do something even more serious. Self-injury can be an adaptive mechanism, a maladaptive one, but it still in some cases might be better than the alternative. And some people who do research in this area advocate for a kind of harm reduction process when you're working with a client who self-injures. Don't take away the razor blade immediately until you understand the function of the behaviour, lest you take away the thing that actually helps someone get through their day. I'll just spend 2 minutes talking about the study that we're working on at the moment. This is a Health Research Council of New Zealand funded study which is intended to be longitudinal. We're going into secondary schools and we are surveying people starting at year 9. We're going back the next year when they're year 10, year 11, 12, 13, 14. And we're doing this because actually one of the things that we don't know about self-injury is why it starts, why some people stop, why some people carry on. The only way that we can really get a good handle on this is by asking the same people again and again and again. We can't do this in the laboratory. There are serious ethical issues with encouraging people to engage in self-injurious behaviour. So what I'm going to do is present, I think this is the first public outing of some of the data that comes out of this. I think Lynn hasn't even seen this summary yet. Just very quickly, these are the data from 700 Year 9 students. As you can see, they're about 13 years of age. They are slightly more likely to be female. 90% describe themselves as 100% heterosexual or straight. 2/3 of them Pākehā, just under 10% Māori. They also completed the suicidal behaviours questionnaire. We do that for screening, and we tell them that if you score over, if you say things in the survey that make us concerned about you, we will break confidentiality and will identify you to the guidance counsellors in your schools. And 15% of those 700 have exceeded the recommended cut-off. 3.3% reported having attempted suicide. They also completed our version of the deliberate self-harm inventory. 75% say they'd never thought about self-injury, 8% had had some ideation, and 17% had engaged in self-injury. And girls were about twice as likely. That's interesting, because Matthew Knox says that there doesn't seem to be a sex difference. There is reason to think that even though overall boys and girls don't self-injure more or less than each other, girls start younger. So if that research is right, what we would expect to see as we go through this project is that the boys' rate will rise to catch up with the girls. And of those who engaged in self-injury, 17, the most common one was carving pictures into themselves, sticking sharp objects into their skin. Preventing wounds from healing is another very common one. But the things I'm really interested in are the things that go along with it. Firstly, the correlation between reporting suicidal ideation and behaviour and non-suicidal ideation and behaviour was really quite strong. It's almost 0.6. That's stronger than the correlation between smoking and developing a smoking-related illness. Same sorts of things that we found previously as protective factors came out here. So the higher self-esteem, resilience, emotion regulation, attachment to parents and peers, the stronger identity with your ethnic group, and the closeness of your family all predict less self-injury. We've also got reason to think that people who report that faith is a really important part of their lives may report less self-injury as well. It's not clear why that might be. Because of some of the religiously based stigma around self-injury, it might be that people who go to faith-based schools may be less likely to report these things because they are concerned about how it might come across. Or it may actually be that it's a legitimate protective factor, and there is some research internationally that suggests that might be the case. Impulsivity, depression and anxiety predicted both self-injury and of all kinds. I'll just finish off by just talking a little bit about bullying. All forms of bullying are associated with non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal ideation and behaviour. Interestingly enough, it appears to be stronger for bullying via social media. And what our research seems to be suggesting at the moment is that compared to text, when someone sends you a text, you know who's sending it. And it's one person, and no one can see it. When someone posts that you're a slag on Facebook, you don't necessarily know who did it, and you know everybody can see it. I think that this is one of the mechanisms by which these things might become problematic. At the same time, it's not the cause of self-injury. The correlation's here about 0.3. Okay, so there's a lot of other things which are going to be more important in that. Now, I suspect I'm on the verge of going over time. Thank you very much for your attention.